Hello horror hounds, welcome to my horror house. Last night I watched quite a delicious little slice of British folk horror, Starve Acre. It's adapted from a novel by Andrew Michael Hurley, which I haven't read. It stars Matt Smith and Morveth Clark as a young family, Richard, Jules and their young son Owen, who move from the city to Yorkshire, this little sort of property on the Yorkshire moors called Starve Acre that used to belong to Richard's abusive father, now deceased. The family think it would be a good move for Owen, who has asthma. You know, the wide open spaces, the fresh air, a sort of new start for all of them. Until that is, young Owen's behaviour starts to change, and he says it's because he can hear whistlings and whisperings from something that he calls Jack Grey. Jack Grey, or Dandelion Jack, happens to be a sort of sprite, a fey folk kind of sprite character that Richard's father happened to be also obsessed with. If you're familiar with the tropes of folk horror, especially British folk horror, there's nothing in Starve Acre that will surprise you. Where I think the movie is successful is it takes very familiar elements from folk horror and sort of remixes it into a story that the film is essentially what I would call a vibe movie. I've seen a lot of user reviews on Amazon say that it's slow, it's boring, nothing really happens. I guess if you go into it expecting a lot of jump scares or whiz bangs and things like that, traditional scares even, you will be disappointed. What this movie does really is wallow itself, as any good folk horror I think wallows itself in the land and the feel of the earth and the countryside seeps into it and creates this unnerving vibe that just stretches out thinner and thinner and thinner. I'm not telling tales out of school when I say that young Owen does die, so the film becomes a meditation and exploration of the grief of these two parents, and in that way it touches an awful lot. You can feel it reaching back through time and touching on Don't Look Now as a sort of foundational stone text. When we dig back into Richard's past and his upbringing a little bit and the beliefs of his father, you'll hear definite sort of grace notes from the story of Hereditary, but where Hereditary was, I view it as a kind of grand opera. I think all of Toni Collette's screaming, screeching monologues is her as a prima donna in an opera singing her arias. So whereas the story in Hereditary is told in a very operatic way, in Starve Acre, a fairly similar story is told much more as a sort of kitchen sink drama. The film is set in the 1970s, and if you were around in the UK in the 1970s, well, boy, I was transported back there instantly. So much knitted clothes, so much corduroy, so much brown. Why were all our clothes brown in the 1970s? It's a great sort of time and a place to sort of bed down and explore all of the very familiar themes of folk horror, but in a way that's very sort of subdued, and everything's sort of kept under the surface until it slowly starts bubbling through, rather than the shrieking sort of histrionics, if you'll allow me that sort of gendered word to describe the goings on in Hereditary. Like Don't Look Now, our wife Jules is a little more open to let's say more spiritual guidance, whereas Richard is an academic archaeologist, and he spends an awful lot of his time now out in the fields digging and uncovering things beneath the surface, ostensibly for his job and for his research, but that's where he sort of focuses his obsessions throughout his grief, whereas his wife is seeking sort of solace with the local spiritualist. And it does get creepy, it does get eerie. There's one sort of kosher scare At about the half-hour mark, that's when things start to turn and get weird, but it's certainly not a film full of jump scares and normal cinematic horror scares. It's all about the mood and the feeling. Lots of gorgeous shots of Yorkshire countryside with an absolutely sort of fantastic atonal kind of score running over it, telling you that the land is the threat. So if you're happy to settle down with it, go at its own pace and vibe with what is a vibe movie rather than waiting for it to become something else, I found Starve Acre to be a really great, eerie ride. I think perhaps the 70s settings really did sort of set me in mind of the old ghost stories for Christmas that used to be on the BBC, especially the ones towards the later end of the run where they stopped adapting M.R. James stories and did some really sort of weird and out there stuff, especially I'm thinking something like Stigma. If I had one negative criticism, I would suggest there's a hair that appears. I'm trying to be spoiler free here and obtuse, but a hair does feature in sort of the final act, and I do wish we had seen less of it. It's very pivotal, and there are times when we see it that are sort of very uncanny and unnerving, but we do see it an awful lot, and I wish they'd sort of reined in on that. At other times, for me, some of the genuine chills came just with characters looking out of the house into the fields surrounding them, and there are a couple of times there are sort of almost tableaus out there that they see, which I found really creepy and chilling. So not outright scary, absolutely not original at all. You can really see all its DNA in it, but I think that kind of does feed into the folksiness of it, if I'm not letting it off the hook a little too easily. It does, these sort of familiar elements do give it the feel of something of the oral tradition that is passed on and remixed and passed on and remixed. If you're after a film that moves fast and has lots of things happening, Starve Acre is not the one for you. If you're after a folk horror movie that really feels like it's got its hands in the sod and the soil, I think Starve Acre is a great little addition to the folk horror subgenre. I'm a little biased. I happen to think that folk horror works at its best when it's set in the British Isles. I appreciate that every other culture around the world has its own folk tradition, and folk horror can pop up, and you can have folk horror stories from every culture around the globe. I've got absolutely no problem with that. I just think folk horror set in the British Isles hits home more for me because this is where I live, and sort of the ancient and indeed prehistoric and pagan roots of this country in an awful lot of places up and down the land are never very far from the surface. Even in a city as modern and multicultural as London, you can turn a corner and find a piece of Roman wall. The name places all around the British Isles just scream of our superstitious and pagan past. So all of that is never ever very far from the surface. So as a Brit, British Isles set folk horror has a particular frisson for me that perhaps folk horror from other countries doesn't quite have. So if you've got a couple of hours and you're willing to sit and vibe with Starve Acre, there's a lot it can give you if you let it wash over you as an experience. I think if you're going to interrogate it and want it to twist it into a form that is not the story it wants to tell you, you're probably going to have a dreadful time with what you think is a plodding and boring movie. But personally, I think it's anything but. I really dug it.
I bid you welcome.
I welcome you to my house.
Welcome to my house.
Welcome to my home.